When 450 German soldiers surrounded one man, he called artillery on himself to save everyone. It began with a scream in the sky. At exactly 50:47 a.m. on November 15, 1944, in the freezing, loud, rain-sodden hills of the Hürtgen Forest, German artillery shells began falling on the forward positions of Charlie Company, 22nd Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division. The shells tore through pine trees that had stood for a century, splintering wood into deadly shards that rained down on American foxholes. The ground, already a quagmire from weeks of autumn rain, erupted in geysers of mud, frozen soil, and fragments of steel. In a shallow, waterlogged command post 60 yards behind the main line, a 24-year-old artillery forward observer from rural Nebraska was jolted awake by the concussion waves hammering his chest. His name was First Lieutenant Lloyd, P.T. Fields. He was not an infantry officer, He was not supposed to be in the front line trenches. His job was to direct the guns from a position of relative safety, to be the calm, calculating eyes far from the chaos. But for the past 72 hours, relative safety had ceased to exist in the HU region. The forest was a meat grinder, a nightmarish tableau where battalions vanished in days, swallowed by a combination of fanatical German defense, the worst weather in European memory, and terrain that nullified every American advantage. Fields wiped condensation from his map case. His hands, numb with a cold that seeped into bones, trembled not from fear but from exhaustion. He had been on the line for 9 consecutive days. In that time, he had watched the company he was attached to shrink from 187 men to 89. They were not just casualties of bullets and shells. Trench foot turned feet black and putrid. Hypothermia stole men in their sleep. Dysentery weakened them until a 5-yard walk to the latrine trench was a monumental effort. And always, the rain, It fell in a perpetual, dreary drizzle, soaking wool coats until they weighed 80 pounds, turning every foxhole into a watery grave. The German shelling intensified. This was not random harassment fire. Fields recognized the pattern. A pre-attack barrage, methodical, punishing, walking from the tree line ahead deeper into the American positions. He grabbed the field telephone, the EE-8, its black box slick with mud. He cranked the handle. A faint, static, filled voice answered from the fire direction center. 3 miles back. Whiskey Base, this is Observer 4. Fire mission, over. He had to shout over the roar of explosions. He gave the map coordinates of the suspected German assembly area, a gully 400 yards to the front that intelligence patrols had reported activity in the previous night, The response was a practiced, calm monotone. Observer 4, Whiskey Base. Roger, fire mission. Estimate shot, out. Fields waited, counting seconds in his head, The time of flight for the 105 Montmartre shells from the howitzers far to the rear, The world narrowed to the sound of incoming German shells and the creeping dread of what would follow them. He thought of home, not of grand ideals or patriotic fervor, but of the specific, tactile memory of his father's barn in late autumn, the smell of hay and dry wood, the warmth of a cow's breath in the cold morning air. He had left that for this, a hole in the ground in a German forest that wanted to kill him. The first American salvo screamed overhead, a sound distinct from the German incoming, a higher, pitched, tearing shriek. Seconds later, explosions blossomed in the distant tree line. Whiskey Base, Observer 4. Add 100, drop 50. Fire for effect. He adjusted, walking the high, explosive shells through the area. But even as he did, He knew it was a guess. The pre-dawn gloom and the dense forest canopy meant he was firing blind. He needed eyes, Lout. The barrage lifted as suddenly as it had begun. The abrupt silence was more terrifying than the noise, Lout. In its place came a new sound, one that chilled the blood more effectively than the November cold tea. The guttural shouts of German infantry, and beneath that, the metallic grind of tank tracks. Fields risked a glance over the lip of his command post. Through the smoke and mist, he saw movement. Dark shapes flitting from tree to tree. Then the silhouettes of helmets, the distinct coal scuttle shape of the German Stahlhelm. They were already much closer than the gully. They had used the barrage as cover to advance hundreds of yards. And there, pushing through the mist like primordial beasts, were two Panzer IV tanks, their long 75mm guns sweeping the American line. A runner, a boy of maybe 19 with wild eyes, slid into the command post, gasping for breath. "Sir! Lieutenant! They're all over the left flank. They came through the draw we thought was mined. Sergeant Jenkins' whole squad is gone!" Field's mind raced, clicking into a cold, analytical gear that overrode the panic screaming in his gut. The German maneuver was a classic pincer movement. The barrage and frontal pressure were a fixation. The real blow was this flanking assault. If those panzers got in behind Charlie Company's main line, it would be a slaughter. The company would be surrounded in minutes. He grabbed the phone again. Whiskey Base, Observer 4. Danger close. I say again, danger close. Shift fire. New coordinates. He read off the numbers, placing the target just 100 yards in front of his own position, right on the path of the advancing German infantry. Calling for artillery this close was a dance with death. The lethal radius of a 105 mm shell was 30 yards. Shrapnel could fly for 200 out. He was asking for his own salvation to land within a football field's length of where he crouched. Observer 4. Confirm danger close. Authenticate Bravo Charlie. Fields gave the day's password. Authenticated it. Fire the mission. The response was taut. Shot out. The wait was an eternity. The German infantry was now clearly visible, moving in fire teams, using the shattered stumps of trees for cover. They were elite Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers out, identifiable by their smock uniforms and aggressive, confident movement. These were not conscripts. They were the best Germany had left. One of them saw him. A shout. A rifle snapped up. A bullet cracked past Field's head, thudding into the dirt log behind him. Then, the beautiful, terrifying scream of American steel out. The first salvo landed 70 yards out. Perfect. The forest floor erupted in a line of fire and dirt. The German advance hesitated. Fields didn't let up. Whiskey Base, drop 50. Fire for effect. The next volley walked directly into the lead German elements. He saw bodies thrown like ragdolls. The advance stalled, the paratroopers diving for cover. But the panzers kept coming. They lumbered forward, their machine guns now chattering, stitching lines of tracers through the American positions. Fields could hear the ping of American M1 Garons firing uselessly at their armored hulls. A bazooka team emerged from a foxhole, but a burst of machine gun fire from the lead tank cut them down before they could fire. Fields had a decision to make out. He could try to break the infantry attack, or he could try to stop the tanks. He couldn't do both with the battery available to him. The tanks were the existential threat. If they broke through, the battle was over. But to stop a tank with a 105 mm howitzer required a miracle, a direct hit on the thin top armor, or a hit that damaged tracks or optics. It was like trying to shoot a charging bull in the eye with a slingshot. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of cordite and damp earth. Whiskey base, Observer 4. Switch to delayed fused. Target armor in the open. Coordinates follow. He was asking for shells that would burrow into the soft ground before exploding out, creating massive craters and sending shockwaves through the earth to disable tanks. It was a long shot. The first shell landed directly between the two panzers. A fountain of mud and roots shot into the air. The second scored a direct hit on the lead tank's hull. Not a penetration, but the massive concussion rocked the 30-ton vehicle on its suspension. It stopped. The hatch flew open, and the crew began bailing out, only to be cut down by American rifle fire. The second panzer, undamaged, reversed, seeking the cover of the tree line. For a moment, Fields allowed himself a sliver of hope. They had blunted the first assault, but that hope died as he scanned the field with his binoculars. The German infantry, though pinned, was not retreating. They were digging in, using shell craters as new fighting positions. And beyond them, in the misty gloom, he saw more movement. Not a company, but what looked like a full battalion. Hundreds of men. They weren't just attacking Charlie Company. They were attempting a local breakthrough of the entire regimental line. And his forward observer position was now a salient, a bump in the front line, with Germans to his front, and, as he soon realized, German infiltration teams moving through the dense woods to his right and left. The runner looked at him, his face pale. "Sir, what do we do?" Fields looked at his map then at the field telephone wire that snaked back toward American lines. That wire was his only lifeline. It was also a tracer, leading straight back to his position. He made a calculation, a grim arithmetic of war. He was one man. Charlie Company held a key piece of terrain, a slight ridge that gave observation over a critical road junction. If they lost it, the German armor could pour through the gap and roll up the entire division's flank. He was the only one who could bring accurate artillery fire to bear. If he left, the company would be overrun by sheer weight of numbers. If he stayed, he would likely die. There was no choice, really. He had never seen it as a choice. "We hold," Fields said, his voice quiet but firm. He picked up the phone again. "Whiskey Base, Observer 4. Prepare for sustained fire mission. I am remaining in position. My coordinates are now the final protective line." Repeat, "My position is the final protective line." On the other end, the fire direction officer understood. The final protective line was a defensive artillery tactic where fire was planned to create a wall of steel directly on a unit's own position, to be used only as a last resort to break an overwhelming enemy assault. By declaring it, Fields was telling his own artillery that he intended to make his last stand in this hole, and that they should be prepared to fire on top of him to kill the enemy. "God be with you." Observer 4. The voice crackled back, the professional monotone finally cracking with emotion. Fields hung up the handset. He turned to the runner, and the two other men in the command post, a radioman and a private first class. "I need one of you to take the azimuth book and the code sheets back to the company's CP. If they overrun us, this information can't fall into their hands." The radioman, an older man with graying hair, shook his head. "I'll stay." "Lieutenant, the radio's useless in this terrain anyway. But someone's gotta crank that phone. The private first class, trembling, nodded. I'll go, sir. Fields handed him the precious documents. Go. Fast. Tell the captain we're holding it. But we need reinforcements, or we're not going to last the hour. The private scrambled out of the hole and vanished into the mist. Fields, the radioman, and the young runner were alone. They checked their weapons, a Colt, .45 pistol for Fields, M1 carbines for the other two. They had 4 grenades between them, and they had a telephone connected to 9 105mm howitzers. Outside their hole, the forest had grown eerily quiet again, save for the moans of the wounded. The Germans were regrouping. Fields knew the next push would be the decisive one, out. They would throw everything they had at this small section of line, knowing its collapse would open a floodgate. He looked at his 2 companions. What are your names? The radioman said, Corporal Donnelly, sir, loud. Pittsburgh. The runner managed a weak smile. Private Ellis. Kansas City. All right, Donnelly Ellis, Fields said. His Nebraska twang calm and steady. We're going to give them a hell of a reception. Donnelly, you crank that phone on my mark. Ellis, you watch our flanks. Shoot anything that moves and isn't wearing olive drab. He peered over the log again. The mist was beginning to thin with the rising, gray dawn, and what he saw made his heart freeze. The German force was not just regrouping, it was encircling him. Movement in the trees to the left, movement to the right. Shadows shifting behind him. They had infiltrated through the dense underbrush, using the confusion of the initial assault. His command post, once 60 yards behind the front, was the front, and it was rapidly becoming an island in a sea of field gray. He was not just holding a position. He was surrounded. 450 German soldiers, some of the toughest veterans of the Eastern Front, were tightening a noose around 1 artillery lieutenant and 2 enlisted men, loud, and at the center of that noose was a field telephone, a spool of wire, loud, and a man who knew that the only way to save his company was to call down the thunder on his own head. The Germans did not charge immediately. They were professionals. They had identified his position as a command node, the source of the devastating artillery that had shattered their first assault. Now, they moved with a methodical, hunting precision. Fields could hear them, not the shouts of a bayonet charge, but the low, guttural clicks of weapons being checked, the rustle of wet canvas smocks against pine branches, the occasional snapped order in German, whispered but carrying in the damp air. They were setting up a perimeter. He was the prey, and they were preparing the trap. He risked another glance. To his left, about 40 yards away, a 2-man MG-42 machine gun team was setting up behind the massive, splintered root system of a fallen tree. That gun, loud, with its rate of fire that sounded like ripping canvas, could pin down the entire company's left flank and cut his position to pieces. He had to act before they finished digging in. He lowered himself, his back against the cold mud wall of the hole. Donnelly looked at him, the question in his eyes. Fields held up a single finger, then pointed to the phone. He mouthed the words, "On my mark." He then took a grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, and held the spoon down. He counted in his head. 1, 2. On 3, he rose, not fully, but just enough to lob the grenade in a high, arcing throw toward the machine gun nest. As soon as the grenade left his hand, he dropped and shouted, "Now, Donnelly! Fire mission! Coordinates. Sierra Tango 7-9er! Danger close!" Donnelly cranked furiously, repeated the coordinates into the handset. The grenade exploded with a sharp, concussive crump. A cry of pain and surprise echoed. He'd disrupted them, not destroyed them. But that wasn't the point. The point was to make them reveal themselves, to get a precise fix. He popped up again, this time with his binoculars. Through the smoke of his own grenade, he saw the machine gun team scrambling. One man was down. Another was dragging him back. He adjusted. Dropped 20, left 10. Fire for effect! He ducked down. The response time was agonizing. 10 seconds. 20. He could hear the Germans now. Closer, moving in. A burst of rifle fire smacked into the logs above his head. Ellis returned fire with his carbine. The reports sharp and fast. "They're working around right, Lieutenant!" Ellis yelled. Then the beautiful sound. The shrieking overlord of the shells. They landed exactly where he'd called them. The explosion was colossal. A direct hit on the fallen tree. The root system, the machine gun, the crew, all vanished in a storm of dirt, wood, and metal. The shockwave hit his position, a physical blow of air pressure that made his ears pop. A momentary silence fell over that sector. He'd bought a few minutes. But the victory was local out. The greater encirclement continued. He was now acutely aware of his isolation. The sounds of battle from Charlie Company's main line seemed distant, muffled by the forest and focused elsewhere out. The Germans were applying pressure all along the front to prevent anyone from sending help to his isolated pocket. He was on his own. He grabbed the map. His position was a dot. Around it, in his mind's eye, he drew a circle with a radius of 50 yards. That was his killing ground. That was where he had to keep the Germans out. If they got inside that circle, they would overrun the hole before artillery could save him. The phone wire was his umbilical cord. If it was cut, he was blind and mute. "Ellis!" he barked. Watch that wire like your life depends on it." "Because it does." The private shifted out, training his carbine on the faint trace of the wire where it disappeared into the brush. The next German move was subtle. A mortar round, then another, walked its way toward his position. Not the heavy artillery from before, but the quicker, high, arsing 81mm mortar. Thump, thump, thump from the tube, then the descending whistle. The first landed 30 yards to his right. The second, 20 yards behind. They were bracketing him. The third would be on target. "Shift," Fields yelled. The three men scrambled out of the command post just as the third round landed directly in it. The explosion obliterated the log reinforcement, the maps, the spare equipment out. Dirt and debris showered them as they landed in a new, shallower depression a few yards away. Donnelly had miraculously kept hold of the telephone box, the wire still attached. They were now in an even more exposed position, a mere scrape in the earth. But they were alive. The destroyed command post was a blessing in disguise. It confirmed to the Germans that they'd scored a hit, hopefully making them overconfident. Fields lay panting, his face pressed into the wet leaves. He could smell the acidic tang of explosive residue and the rich, rotten scent of torn earth. The phone buzzed out. Donnelly handed him the handset. It was Whiskey Base. "Observer 4, we heard that impact. Report status. Whiskey Base. OP is displaced but operational. Continue fire mission. Original coordinates remain valid. They're probing with mortars. Request counter. Battery on suspected mortar position. Grid." He rattled off numbers based on the sound of the tubes. "Observer 4, concur. Shot out. The American guns roared in response, not at his position, but at a target hundreds of yards behind the German lines. It was a gamble, diverting fire. But he had to silence those mortars. He needed a moment to think. The German infantry, seeing the direct hit on his OP, now began their final closing maneuver. He could see them advancing in short rushes from tree to tree. Using the terrain with expert skill, they were no longer a faceless horde. He could see individual faces, a man with a scar, another with a beard, a young one who looked terrified. They were men, just like him, cold, wet, and trying to survive. But they were between him and his company. They were the barrier. The artillery fire on the mortar position had the desired effect. The thump stopped. Now was his moment. He had to break their will before they closed the final distance. He had one tool: shock. He had to create such a concentrated, horrific storm of steel around his own position that the Germans would believe they were attacking an entire fortified company. Not 3 men in a hole. "Donnelly," he said, his voice a low rasp, "we're going to paint a circle of hell. Get ready to adjust fast." He began calling fire not on the Germans' position, but on a ring around his own. Whiskey base. Fire mission. Concentric ring starting at 50-yard radius from my position. Grid bases follows. He dictated a series of coordinates, creating a clock face of death around his scrape in the ground. Fire 1 battery per coordinate in sequence. Walk the ring, then repeat. Do not stop until I say break. It was an audacious, almost insane demand. He was asking the artillery to fire a protective wheel of high explosives with him at the hub. The margin for error was 0. A short round would vaporize him. The fire direction officer, to his credit, only asked for one authentication. Then he said, "Shot out." The world dissolved into sound and fury. The first salvo landed due north, 50 yards out. The ground jumped. Then east, then south, then west. The explosions marched in a terrifying, precise circle around them. From their low vantage point, it looked like the end of the world. Trees disintegrated. Earth fountained. Shrapnel whistled through the air in a 360-degree torrent. The advancing German infantry, caught in the open as they made their final dash, was savaged. The disciplined rushes turned into chaos. Men were thrown down. Others fled back into the forest, away from the maelstrom. The circle of fire created a temporary, lethal barrier. But Fields knew it was temporary. It consumed ammunition at a prodigious rate, and it fixed his location with absolute certainty for every German observer. He was trading time for exposure. As the first ring finished, he called for a second, tighter ring at 40 yards. Then a third at 30, out. He was tightening the noose of fire around himself, daring the Germans to step into the gap. The noise was beyond deafening. It was a physical presence, a pressure that battered the mind. Donnelly and Ellis had their hands over their ears, faces white with terror and awe. They were no longer soldiers in a battle, out. They were spectators to an elemental force their lieutenant had summoned. The German pressure ceased. The rifle fire stopped, out. The woods outside the burning, smoking ring were silent. The acrid smell of smoke and explosives was suffocating, out. Field's ears rang with a high-pitched whine. He grabbed the phone. "Whiskey base. Break, break, break. Cease fire. Cease fire." The sudden silence that followed was as shocking as the barrage. It was a thick, heavy silence, broken only by the crackle of burning wood and the distant moans of the wounded. Smoke drifted in thick, gray tendrils through the shattered pine trunks. He waited, straining his hearing. Nothing had they broken.